The horse lost control during the funeral and kicked the owner's coffin till the lid broke. Everyone was stunned and paralyzed by what came out. It was just another quiet, ordinary morning in the dusty little hamlet of Marfa, Texas. A man who had dedicated his life to tilling these unyielding fields, breathing in the dry air, and caring for the few animals on his little ranch. Mason's spirit was reflected in the parched and unforgiving ground. Mason, who was well known for his quiet persistence, had never looked for a life outside of these untamed plains. He found comfort in the crows of roosters, welcoming the dawn in the distance and in the ruts of the earth. Dawson, his neighbor, broke the quiet as he finished his morning chores by running breathlessly toward him. Dawson yelled, "Mason!" with a sharp edge to his voice. "There's a foal abandoned by the river trail. It's barely able to stand. Looks like someone just left it there." "Poor thing." Mason shook his head sorrowfully and mumbled. He felt compelled to act at that time as if an unseen thread were tugging at his heart. He dropped his tools and made for the trail without hesitation. Something in Dawson's remarks resonated, even though Mason had intervened to save a defenseless animal before. Something was different, like this meeting was supposed to be. When he got there, the scene in front of him stopped him cold. The foal was lying by the side of the dusty road, a shaky, frail creature that was just surviving. With its big, dark eyes staring at Mason with a frightening mixture of terror and exhaustion, its dirt-caked coat hung closely to its frail body. With a gentle and comforting tone, Mason approached cautiously and whispered, "Oh, little one, what have they done to you?" He was aware that the foal was in a vulnerable position, and that any abrupt movement could frighten it and deplete its last vigor. The foal attempted to stand up on its spindly legs as he approached, but they gave way under its weight, and it fell back to the ground in a cloud of dust. On the route, a few people stopped to observe, their mutterings full of doubt. An older man with a straw hat grimly shook his head. "Mason, that foal's as good as gone. Why trouble yourself? It'll only be another burden for you." Mason hardly paid attention to what was being spoken, instead concentrating on the tiny creature in front of him, whose ragged breathing and quivering body spoke of an existence on the brink. Mason believed that all living things were valuable, regardless of their size or fragility. He noticed something when his eyes locked with the foal's. A sliver of life, brittle but unyielding. He only needed that glimmer as confirmation. He knelt down slowly and carefully raised the colt into his arms. It was a startlingly light animal, and its weakness was almost tragic. Although Mason felt a little chill against him, he reassured him by whispering, "I've got you now. As long as you're breathing, there's hope." He started the arduous trek back to his ranch with determination. The spectators exchanged suspicious looks, but Mason ignored them. This foal was not a weight in his heart. Rather, it was a promise, a duty he had to fulfill. After arriving home, Mason placed the foal gently on a bed of fresh straw in the old barn and saw as the animal changed, finally finding some measure of peace. He whispered, "I'll call you Stella," with a slight smile on his lips, "because that's what you are, life." The name seemed appropriate, reflecting the second chance he was certain to grant this frail creature. Stella was a pledge, not simply a name. Mason made a secret vow to use every resource at his disposal to save this foal. He remained up by the barn door that night, keeping a close eye on Stella. Every now and again he would come over, bringing water and whispering encouraging things. He muttered, "Rest, Stella," his voice a soft salve in the silence. "Tomorrow will be better." With a mixture of hope and fear in his heart, Mason made his way back to the barn as the first rays of dawn appeared on the horizon. It had been a long night, and he had been tense at every slight movement and sound. However, he was certain as soon as he entered that he would battle for Stella's existence, one tiny step at a time. The little foal's respiration was still feeble, but she seemed calmer now. Mason's pulse raced as he approached her, worried that she might not be alive, but there she was, lying on the hay, her big, dark eyes looking at him with a weary but appreciative expression. Not wanting to spend any more time, Mason gently raised her in his arms and headed for the village veterinarian, an elderly, seasoned guy with a keen knowledge of animals. Even though the road wasn't too far, The trip seemed to take forever on that cold morning. The veterinarian, whose keen eyes narrowed as he examined the weak foal in Mason's arms, came out to meet them when he eventually got there. As he examined her closely and adjusted his glasses, Mason inquired, "What do we have here?" Mason said, "It's Stella," in a calm, deep voice that belied the raging storm of anxiety inside of him. "I found her abandoned near the river. I couldn't just leave her there." The veterinarian acknowledged the relationship that was already developing between the guy and the struggling animal and nodded, a silent agreement between them. The veterinarian sighed deeply after a thorough examination. "Listen, Mason, I don't want to give you false hope. Stella is extremely weak. Her body barely has the strength to sustain her, and honestly, the prognosis isn't good." He hesitated, trying to find the appropriate words, his demeanor solemn as he gazed at Mason. She might not make it after all. The veterinarian's grim tone made Mason's stomach turn, but he fought the urge to mistrust. He glanced down at Stella, who was lying on the examination table, breathing shallowly. Mason's resolute response was, "As long as she's still breathing, Doc, I'm not giving up." There was no room for debate in the conviction in his voice. Both guys could see that Stella was more than simply an animal to Mason. She was a commitment and a promise. Mason's tenacity impressed the veterinarian, who nodded and gave him a set of instructions. He also offered Mason a little bottle of vitamins and some additional advice, saying, "She'll need soft food that's easy to digest. Keep her warm, especially at night. The cold could make things worse. Do your best, Mason, and may God be with you." Mason embraced Stella and made his way home with a fresh sense of purpose. His work started that evening. As instructed by the veterinarian, he made a concoction of softened feed and warm milk and gave it to Stella in little doses. She initially refused, her frail body scarcely reacting, but Mason waited. He spoke softly to her, his words encouraging and consoling, as if they would persuade her to keep fighting. He muttered, "Come on, Stella, you're not alone, I'm right here with you." As he caressed her slender back and felt her delicate bones beneath his palm. He touched her carefully, hoping that his tenderness and concern might rekindle her desire to live. Weeks passed with no sign of Mason leaving Stella's side. As the chilly winter air seeped through the gaps in the barn, he had to get up in the middle of the night to feed her and make sure she remained warm. Every day seemed like a minor triumph, a never-ending battle waged with love and patience. The nights were long, but Stella's eyes, those glimmering signs of life that told Mason she had not given up, gave him strength. Then one early morning, as Mason was keeping his regular watch, he saw something new. Stella was attempting to stand. Her weight made her brittle legs shake. Mason held his breath, paying close attention to every move. She faltered and fell once more, but she persisted. She took a deep, resolute breath and tried again, this time staying upright for a few valuable seconds before stumbling. Mason felt an incredible sense of joy in that fleeting moment. Stella was fighting, and that was all that mattered to him, even if he knew the road ahead was still long. Over the next few weeks, Stella started to move hesitantly, first just a few unsteady steps, then a bit more. When she wavered, Mason was there to support and steady her. Mason's pride was unbounded, as though her triumphs were his own, and every stride she took was a victory. The neighbors couldn't help but be in awe of the young horse's transformation as they passed Mason's property. He was now regarded with admiration by those who had before pushed him to give up on his endeavors. Some came to ask how he was doing, while others silently observed from a distance in awe of Mason's unrelenting commitment to Stella over the months. Mason and everyone who had previously questioned Stella's ability to recuperate saw her transformation. The weak, shaky foal had developed into a powerful, graceful mare, with a coat that shone in the sunlight, a testament to the love and attention she had received. Every time Mason gazed upon Stella, he saw a living example of tenacity and willpower. He was deeply grateful and proud at the same time. He was reminded by Stella of his own struggles, the silent conflicts he had engaged in, and the invisible wounds that bore the burden of his history. As time went on, Stella and Mason grew close in a subtle but meaningful way. Stella always found her way to him, regardless of his location or activity, as though she knew she belonged by his side. Mason used to be amazed at how she followed him around the farm, her dark, watchful eyes focused on him, as if each movement he made had some special meaning for her. He would caress her back and say, "Stella, my faithful companion," with tenderness. And Stella, in her usual quiet, would droop her head, embracing his touch with mutual consent. They didn't have to speak. All they had to do was be together to express their feelings. But one day, Stella noticed right away that Mason had a weight about him when he came at the farm. He walked slowly, and his eyes appeared to be deep in inarticulate thoughts. As if to share his burden, Stella walked right up to him and laid her head gently on his shoulder. Mason's face lit up slightly at that small, sincere gesture. For a time, he closed his eyes and allowed the peaceful solace she provided to envelope him. He caressed her head and whispered, "Thank you, Stella," his voice just above a whisper. In that instant, Mason understood that Stella was more than simply an animal. She was a kindred spirit, a presence he could rely on even during his darkest moments. Sometimes it feels like you're the only one who truly understands. The neighbors started discussing Mason and his mare's special friendship as their attachment became stronger over time. Some said, "It's like they share the same soul," while others were struck. They treated the connection with silent reverence, as if it were a sacred entity that defied analysis or justification. For Mason, each day spent with Stella was a gift. She had changed from a weak, defenseless being into a living example who inspired everyone in her path. She had restored to him what he believed had been lost: hope. Face every day with optimism, a friend who made his loneliness more bearable. One evening, Mason sat on an old log and watched Stella graze nearby as the sun sank below the mountains, illuminating the sky with orange hues. He had a soft grin on his lips, the kind that only people who have truly discovered peace can have. In a quiet voice, he said, "Look at this, Stella," as though addressing himself. As though she had heard him, Stella raised her head and walked gently toward him with her characteristic, elegant, deliberate gait. All the effort, all the time, it was worth it. As she came to him, Mason held out his hand, and Stella touched it with her muzzle, a wordless vow, an unspoken bond. From that day on, Mason was certain that Stella would always play a significant role in his life, regardless of how many seasons passed. She gave him the strength to continue as well as company. Every sunrise they saw together served as a reminder of the choice he had made that far-off morning when he discovered her weak and alone, as well as his promise to take care of her for as long as he had breath. As the years went by, Mason started to realize that his body was betraying him in ways that had never happened to him before. The limitless vitality that used to sustain him during lengthy days now dwindled far too soon. Mornings had become a struggle. Getting out of bed took more willpower than he wanted to acknowledge, and every motion seemed heavier. Once a steady and dependable rhythm, his heart now faltered suddenly, leaving him out of breath at the most inconvenient times. Mason tried to hide his vulnerability, but he knew deep down that something was very wrong. He was trying to raise a huge grain sack one afternoon when a piercing ache shot through his chest. He had to drop the sack and lean against a nearby wall for support, since the pressure was so great. For a little period, the world appeared to change beneath him, as his breaths came in ragged rushes. His faithful mare, Stella, stood close by and looked up at his anguish. Approaching slowly, she softly pressed her muzzle against his shoulder, as if to lend her strength or at least some unspoken support. As he strained to keep his balance, Mason extended his hand and found solace in the softness of her mane. His voice was low and doubtful, as though he were attempting to persuade himself more than her. "Don't worry, Stella, I've still got this. I've still got you," he said. However, Stella's big, heartfelt eyes appeared to see right through his facade, displaying an awareness of the suffering he was trying so hard to conceal. In the days that followed, Stella started to spend more time with Mason. A persistent shadow of her watchful presence, she followed him across the land. She had evolved from the reliable friend of his childhood into a silent protector who was always on guard and close at hand. Although he made an effort to act as though nothing had changed, Mason secretly appreciated her calm devotion and felt the weight of her attentive stare. As his own strength diminished, the unseen connection between them felt more vital than ever. Mason eventually had to face the fact that he had been avoiding. Even the most basic duties had become impossible, and his previously endless days working the farm were long gone. He asked his nephew, Oliver, for assistance without much hesitation. Strong and kind-hearted, Oliver accepted without hesitation and immediately assumed responsibility for the everyday tasks that had previously been Mason's pride, such as feeding the animals, tilling the soil, and doing the chores. Stella, though, took a while to greet Oliver. Mason remained the center of her universe, as evidenced by her guarded posture and her veiled skepticism of him. Even though he could hardly get past the front door, Stella would always find her way back to Mason's side, seeking the solace of his company no matter how softly Oliver attempted to approach her. Despite his ongoing weariness, Mason made the decision one afternoon to pay Stella a visit in the corral. The notion of seeing his old friend gave him the strength to keep going, even if every step was difficult. As though anticipating his arrival, she was there waiting when he did. Stella approached him at the same slow pace as him, her slow, deliberate steps reflecting his weakness. Mason ran his fingers down her smooth neck and muttered, "You always know when I need you, don't you, Stella?" With a deep, steady exhale that seemed to drop with his, Stella leaned into his touch. Mason took comfort in such moments, a little escape from the inexorable toll that time had inflicted on him. However, time passed without regard for their relationship. Mason's travels to the corral were less frequent as his strength continued to wane. It was getting harder and harder to find a day when he could spend time with Stella outside. Mason would observe her grazing in the distance or standing motionless, staring toward the house as if anticipating his arrival from the window of his humble abode. Stella would occasionally approach the porch warily when Oliver left the door open on his way to the fields. With hesitation but determination, she would look inside as though looking for an old friend. Mason experienced a range of feelings at seeing her so close, a strong sense of thankfulness for the unwavering love she still offered, as well as an aching for what he had lost. It appeared that the mare who had depended on him was now keeping watch over him. Despite the change in their roles, their relationship remained strong and unaffected by time or situation. Mason whispered, "Ah, Stella," in a voice that was hardly audible. "It seems the roles have reversed. Now it's you taking care of me." They were connected in those delicate times by an unsaid bond, a connection that went beyond words. When it was impossible to get out of bed, Oliver took over, caring for Stella instead of Mason. However, Stella was by Mason's side whenever he could find the strength to walk to the pasture, even if it was only for a few valuable minutes. They both seemed to understand that every moment they spent together was precious and valuable. A simple yet profound love was silently witnessed by the sunlight filtering through the trees and the soft air blowing across the vast plains. As Mason's health started to deteriorate, this connection, which was formed in the fragility of life, became even more solid. His condition deteriorated day by day. He was increasingly confined to his modest, small abode, where even the sunshine was reluctant to enter, illuminating it with a tentative glow through the thin curtains. His chest began to hurt, and every breath became difficult. His family took turns providing for him, including water and other necessities. However, Mason's thoughts strayed well beyond the four walls enclosing him. His mind kept returning to Stella. Every time he had the wherewithal to speak, he would inquire about her. "Is she all right? Has she been fed? Has anyone let her roam in her favorite spots?" The mayor hung in his head like a persistent worry that would not go away. Mason was aware that his time was running out, and the uncertainty surrounding Stella's destiny was a burden that was nearly unbearable. Mason had an epiphany one late afternoon, after a small break from the agony. "Oliver," he muttered, "open the window. Please let me hear the fields, feel the air, and perhaps see Stella." Oliver carefully drew back the curtains and swung the window wide. With a sigh of relief, the cold country air blew in, and there she was, pulled by the same force. With her black silhouette set against the golden hues of the setting sun, Stella emerged on the field. When Mason saw her, his eyes grew softer. Sensing his eyes, Stella started to approach the home gently. She halted just short of the porch, her silent presence radiating as she stood motionless where the light and shadows met. Mason smiled a little and said, "Stella, my dear Stella, you've always been so much more than just an animal to me," in a frail whisper. Stella appeared to be intensely conscious of her friend's weakness from that point on. She went to the window every day, waiting calmly as though she realized how short their time together had become. For hours she remained still, providing her quiet company. No words were required. His last days were somewhat less lonely because of her presence alone, which brought a calm comfort to the space. With a mixture of amazement and incredulity, Mason's family observed this silent rite. While some conjectured about the depths of an animal's feelings, others asserted that they had never witnessed such devotion from an animal. But they knew Stella understood when they saw her standing resolutely by the window. As her beloved companion's days shortened, Stella had assumed the position of a protector in her calm, cautious manner. Stella's motions became increasingly thoughtful and kind with time. Occasionally, the family was able to lead her inside. She would rest her head on Mason's bed, her gentle muzzle grazing his fingers. Even though he was weak and could hardly raise his arm, Mason would still reach out and caress her neck. He experienced a deep sense of calm during those tiny, priceless moments of connection, as though his whole existence had been condensed into those brief touches. One evening, Mason said, "Thank you, Stella," his voice cracking with passion. With a well of comprehension that went beyond words, Stella's black eyes looked at him and said, "Thank you for being here." It seemed as though the distinction between humans and animals had completely vanished, leaving only the purest manifestation of love, devotion, and an unspoken farewell. There were no distinctions or obstacles in those times, just the enduring love and true friendship that united them at their core. As the days passed, Stella started to exhibit an odd restlessness, as if she could sense a shift that was unavoidable. More often, she wandered to the window, pacing tensely across the porch, her eyes often settling on Mason's empty bed. The mayor was very aware of the approaching parting, as Oliver could see by watching her. Everyone in the vicinity felt that Stella was preparing herself for the moment when her loyal companion would no longer be around, even if no one could understand it. Mason breathed his last breath in the company of loved ones on a quiet and solemn morning. His family's muted sobs and the faint murmurs of their prayers were the only sounds to break the profound quiet that pervaded the house. As soon as word got out, friends and neighbors came to pay their respects to the kind man who was adored by everyone in the little town. Because Mason had been more than just another farmer, a man who commanded respect, a devoted friend, and an ethical spirit whose life had impacted so many, faces reflected the communal anguish. Devastated by his death, the family started planning a funeral that would pay tribute to him in the same modest manner that he had lived. Simple and devoid of ornate frills, the ceremony would be filled with profound respect and appreciation for the man Mason had been. Soft whispers filled the air as the family prepared for the service that morning, remembering the lessons and stories he had told so many people in the community. The devoted horse who had spent so many mornings with Mason, Stella, had another heart, one that ached in a manner that words could not express. Void keenly. It had been an unbroken routine for years, starting from the moment he failed to come to the pasture to greet her. At dawn, Mason would approach the corral, and together they would begin their day. But this time, the corral remained eerily quiet, and the gate never swung open. Confused and uneasy, Stella started pacing back and forth, casting hopeful glances toward the house, waiting for Mason to appear. But as the hours passed without him showing up, she began to wander the property, looking everywhere as if she might find some trace of him. Her movements became more frantic, and the sorrow in her eyes, silent despair, pierced the hearts of everyone who saw her. Mason's nephew, Oliver, saw Stella's strange behavior and saw that she was also grieving. The loss was as unfathomable to her as it was intolerable, and, fearing that Stella would disturb the funeral, He and other family members led her to the barn and kept her there until the ceremony was over. But as soon as Stella realized she was confined, she started kicking at the stall door, pounding the ground with her hoofs and letting out loud, distressed whinnies. It was her way of protesting, of refusing to accept the separation from Mason. For her, being kept away from him at such a time was an unbearable, inexplicable tension. However, the family had no choice but to keep her enclosed, fearing her presence might disturb the solemnity of the service. Oliver muttered under his breath, "Stella," knowing there was no way to calm her, each stomp of her hooves echoing through the stillness, a physical manifestation of her anguish. The anguish of Stella echoed from the barn as friends and family gathered in the yard for the ceremony, her whinnies resonating over the quiet gathering, each sound laced with raw pain that everyone could feel. Some mourners turned their eyes toward the barn with heavy hearts, acutely aware that the mare was grieving as deeply as they were, and her sorrow hung in the air like a tangible force, amplifying the weight of the loss they all felt. The ceremony went on in a solemn silence, with each person taking their turn to say goodbye to Mason, reflecting silently on the lasting impression he had left on their lives. There were no elaborate speeches or elaborate words, only sorrowful expressions and solemn looks of respect for the man who now lay in peace. And as each person said goodbye in their own way, the echoes of life still confined in the stable reverberated in their hearts. The stable trembled under the rhythmic pounding of hooves against its doors, a desperate symphony of strength and longing. The mare, confined and misunderstood, couldn't stay motionless, as if something deep inside her compelled her to be close to her friend in this last moment. She couldn't bear to be apart, not while others were allowed to say goodbye. Her restless heart seemed to beat in time with her attacks on the door, each louder, more forceful, until finally the door gave way with a thunderous burst of energy. Stella galloped out, her strength and speed stunning those around her as she surged toward the ceremony. Mason's family and friends parted in her path, their faces painted with fear and confusion, and the solemn atmosphere was broken by a wave of startled murmurs, some of them retreating to make room for the unexpected arrival. Nevertheless, Stella persisted, her dark, piercing eyes burning with an unwavering determination, a powerful mixture of grief and resolve. Gradually, it became evident that she was not merely running, but that she was looking for something or someone, and at last, her eyes met Mason's coffin. Stella rushed forward, only pausing when she came to it, and struck the wooden surface with one strong hoof, stopping the murmurs with the sharp, resonant sound of hoof against wood. She struck the coffin again and again, each blow carrying a weight beyond instinct, as though she were trying to convey something urgent, something no one else could comprehend. And the rhythm of her blows seemed almost like a plea, a lament, or a cry for assistance. A family member cautiously walked up to her and yelled, "Stella, stop it!" But Stella wasn't going to back down. There was a power behind her actions, a will that no human command could break. Each blow echoed like an unspoken bond, a testament to the love and loyalty she couldn't give up. As confusion set in among the mourners, a few courageous individuals came forward to try to calm her, but to no avail. Stella's unwavering determination prevailed, and her incessant hoofbeats sounded through the tense air like a mournful chant. After a particularly hard blow, the wood splintered a little, creating a tiny crack. The crowd gasped as Mason's sister stepped forward, a mix of fear and hope flickering in her eyes. Driven by an unexplained urge, she knelt next to the coffin, her hands shaking as they touched the broken surface, and she leaned in and pressed her ear to the crack. At first, there was only the heavy silence of death, but then a faint sound like a whisper reached her ears, which made her eyes widened. "Something is within, something is inside." Her words sent a jolt through the gathered crowd, freezing them in place. It was a moment suspended in disbelief, time itself seeming to hold its breath. Spurred into action, a few men stepped forward with shaking hands. They began to pry the lid open, their faces etched with fear and urgency. Stella stood nearby, motionless now, her eyes fixed on the coffin with an intensity that suggested her work wasn't done yet. The air grew thick with anticipation as the men worked, every creak of the wood amplifying the tension. Finally, with one last effort, the lid was lifted, revealing Mason's still form. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Almost inaudible, a sigh emerged from it. Was hardly audible, but it was clear. A thin thread of life still held him. The mourners stared in startled silence, frozen in shock. Someone said, "He's alive," with such passion that their voice broke. The crowd was overcome with a mixture of excitement and incredulity. Mason's eyelids opened slowly. He squinted against the incoming sun, his face etched with bewilderment as he attempted to make sense of what had just happened. Mason's wide-eyed gaze slowly calmed, adapting to the shocked expressions around him. He looked across the crowd, still confused, frantically looking for something recognizable, a lifeline in the midst of what seemed like nightmarish mayhem. At last his eyes saw Stella, the devoted Mayare, standing quietly off to one side, her head cocked slightly as though she was waiting for them to meet again. "Stella," Mason said in a tone that was feeble and almost audible. Even though his body was weak, seeing his loyal friend gave him a deep sense of calm and a sense of relief that, in spite of everything, he had survived a place where few people ever return. Stella took a hesitant step forward at hearing her name, her big dark eyes staring at Mason's. There was an unsaid link between them that went beyond the human experience, and was so strong that it even called into question the finality of death. Mason's family cried aloud around them. As they took in the amazing sight, they were filled with both appreciation and disbelief, something that no one had dared dream for. Hesitantly, his sister came over, her feelings overtaking her as she grasped his hand tenderly and sobbed in private. Others dabbed at their tears, looking at Stella with awe as they finally realized how devoted she was. Mason had not fallen into everlasting rest because of her unwavering devotion. A family member said, "Thank you, Stella," in an emotional stutter. Mason nodded weakly, his heart assured of the event's veracity, but his head still struggling to process them. It was she who saved you. He was protected by Stella's unfailing devotion, which kept him from falling. The local doctor, who had hurried over after hearing the ruckus, broke the murmurs of the assembled audience. He pushed through the crowd and knelt next to Mason, monitoring his vital signs and pulse. He finally let out a sigh of relaxation and spoke to the group with a calculated air of authority. The doctor clarified, "What Mason experienced is an extremely rare condition called catalepsy." He turned to Mason's family, who hung onto his every word, their looks a mix of astonishment and perplexity. In this state, the body becomes utterly immobile, with breathing so faint it mimics death. Many mistake it for the real thing. It's rare, but it happens. Somehow Mason's bond with Stella must have allowed her to sense what we could not, that he was still alive, though imperceptibly so. She made us realize he was still here. Slowly the audience nodded, turning back to Stella, whose composed demeanor stood in stark contrast to the flurry of emotions surrounding her. She stayed by Mason's side, calm as ever, as if she had known what everyone else had only recently learned. With each breath, Mason felt the world come back to life. Stella lowered her muzzle to meet his as he extended a hand toward her. The warmth and feel of her skin confirmed that he was indeed alive. He had been reclaimed by life itself, and Stella had been the link that held him to this planet. He said, "Thank you, Stella," in a voice that was almost audible, but was filled with deep appreciation. Stella appeared to comprehend, her big black eyes displaying an inexpressible intelligence. People who were witnessing the spectacle were moved. Some sobbed out, while others stood in silent awe, realizing that what they were seeing was extraordinary, a demonstration of love and loyalty that went beyond the norm. Mason's family treated him like a piece of glass, carrying him home with the greatest care following the wonderful reunion. After such a terrifying near-death experience, they were vividly conscious of his vulnerability. The house was a place of warmth and watchfulness in the days that followed. Mason's loved ones were by his side constantly, loving him and savoring every second of his second shot at life. No one appeared to pay as much attention as Stella, who had become Mason's constant shadow ever since he returned. Stella was nearly impatient as she waited for Mason the first time he was able to enter the pasture following days of recuperation. She moved warily toward him, as though she could sense that he was still getting stronger. Still slender, Mason reached out and gave her a deep, quiet hug. As if her very presence could replenish the energy he had lost, Stella remained steadfast and allowed him to relax against her neck. Mason said, "Thank you, Stella." In a quiet but appreciative voice, he realized that without Stella's incredible presence, he may not be standing there at all, yet those two simple words conveyed a depth of passion that he could never properly express. After that, Stella was more than just a horse to him. She was a part of his spirit, a friend who had a connection to him that words could never adequately express. Mason gradually regained his vigor as the days went by. Stella was welcomed as a member of his family, who were extremely grateful for the second chance they had been given. She had evolved from an animal to a beloved family member who could not be replaced. The whole family had come to love and respect Stella because of her steady manner and unflinching devotion. The tale of Mason and Stella swiftly swept across their tiny town, spreading like wildfire from one individual to another. As neighbors marveled at how a simple horse had done the impossible, waking Mason from what had looked like perpetual darkness, each tale was infused with awe and respect. Stella, who to many had seemed like an unending sleep, turned into a living example of unwavering devotion and a love so pure that it could surpass the limits of existence. Mason spent more and more time with Stella as his strength increased. He talked softly to her, telling her of the times and experiences that had altered them forever. They developed a ritual of spending their afternoons together, walking silently side by side through the fields, their relationship evident without the need for words. Every step Mason took with Stella served as a reminder of the important lessons she had imparted to him silently. The townspeople were thrilled with a mixture of admiration and reverence as they saw the guy and his horse move together. Seeing Mason and Stella together was even compared by some to seeing a daily miracle, a physical representation of a bond that transcended reason or explanation. The town's residents saw this man and his horse as standing for something much bigger than themselves, a hope that spoke to the core of the human spirit. The tale of Stella and Mason became a legend over time. It was told at family get-togethers, around dinner tables, and even enthralled the community's youngest residents. Their story of commitment and love warmed people's hearts everywhere, and served as a constant reminder that love and friendship may triumph over even the threat of death. Deeply conscious of the lessons Stella had taught him, Mason committed to treating her with the same affection that she had shown him. Only one who has come close to death could really appreciate the love with which he gazed at her. He tried to express his thanks in every kind word and touch, even though he realized he could never fully compensate her for what she had done. With his hand running over her smooth hair, he would whisper softly, "Stella, you are my friend, my family, and my miracle." As always, Stella looked at him with calm eyes and a timeless knowledge in her demeanor. She seemed to be able to understand all of his unsaid feelings and thoughts. After a while, Mason went back to his farm life, but this time he was grateful for every sunrise and every peaceful moment he shared with his loyal friend. He had learned from his experience that true love could do marvels, that life was fleeting, and that every moment was a gift. The tale of Mason and Stella became more than just a fairy tale to the town. It turned into a powerful reminder of love and loyalty that beyond the limits of the human heart, and a monument to the sacred relationships that may exist between beings. Every smile Mason gave and every energetic neigh of Stella gave the people hope that life's little miracles were beautiful. Thus, with a fresh feeling of purpose, farm life continued on amidst the everyday grind in the tranquil countryside. Held together by a sacred link that had accomplished the impossible, Mason and Stella, bound by an astonishing experience, continued to go forward together as they always had. Their story, a narrative of unwavering love and dedication that went beyond the realm of imagination, would inspire anybody who heard it. Through an emotionally charged story, we see the deep bond between a man and his loyal horse, and how it can be a lifeline during the most trying times. Stella's wordless devotion mirrors Mason's progression from the strength of his youth to the weakness of his disease. Her devotion beyond all expectations revealing a profound comprehension that words could never express. At its core, this tale conveys a potent message. Despite overwhelming obstacles, love and empathy have the capacity to change. True connection transcends both species and situational limitations, as demonstrated by Stella's saving of Mason from certain death when she recognized the danger he was facing. Their tale reminds us that even relationships with animals may provide us with unending comfort and strength, and it encourages us to treasure the relationships we create. In the end, the story of Mason and Stella turns into a ray of hope, a monument to the invaluable worth of genuine loyalty, a gem that can perform miracles in the most unexpected circumstances. Remember to like and share this story if it resonated with you. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment describing how it inspired you. May you be blessed and have God accompany you on your journey.